To serve under your chairmanship in this important debate, and I rise to speak today as someone who has a bill forthcoming on increasing the sentencing for animal cruelty, but I think it behoves all of us with an interest in the welfare of our animals to be here today to speak out and ensure that our system protects those who cannot speak out themselves about abuse and cruelty. And this is especially important for animals involved in a working environment where the nature of the industry can put animals under unusual pressure and strain. Greyhound racing is a long-established leisure activity, but its success must be built on fair treatment of the animals involved, from cradle to grave. Excuse me. There are some real concerns about how far the 2010 welfare of racing greyhounds regulations have led to sufficient protection for racing greyhounds, and Defra's review into their success does not adequately take those into account. Self-regulation of the industry through the Greyhound Board of Great Britain is not open, not accountable, and has lost the confidence of many stakeholders and greyhound welfare organisations. The self-regulator is not being sufficiently transparent to demonstrate that greyhound racing is a welfare-friendly activity. One of the biggest issues is the lack of openly published data on the welfare of racing greyhounds. Baseline data on injury, euthanasia and homing after retirement from racing should be published by both GBGB licensed tracks and by independent tracks monitored by local authorities. Without this data, accurate comparisons can simply not be made. Indeed, the RSPCA have called for greater transparency in collection and publication of data throughout the life of every greyhound. In a submission to the Defra Select Committee, they said, and I quote, "The best way of doing this would be to adopt a joined-up approach to track dogs born in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, utilising one centralised database which could be used to capture information on racing status, injuries, drugs, retirement, etc., and could be used for rolling analysis and to identify patterns and allow remedial action to be taken, for example, should there be found to be an issue at a particular track." It could be argued that the government itself is encouraging the industry to be opaque by failing to ensure that these baseline statistics are published so that industry's performance can be evaluated. In 2007, the Associate Parliamentary Group for Animal Welfare recommended the industry should be required by law to publish annual statistics. Excuse me, Mr. Rossendale. 10 years on, Defra's position to simply encourage the regulator to...
One more friend, give way.
I will, thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you, Mr. Rossendale. I'm grateful for the opportunity to intervene in my honourable friend, because she's making the same point that was raised by the chair of the Select Committee, and I mentioned myself and also the honourable lady who spoke just before, that the statistics for injured animals are very important. The Minister's got a great track record on this, if you excuse the pun. He was pushing the industry all the way down the line. He got them to make the agreement. There has been a bit of slippage, in my view, no disrespect to him, that the deadline is now 2017-18. The figures do exist. They ought to be available, and hopefully, as a result of this debate and decisions elsewhere, they will be published.
Thank you. I really appreciate my honourable friend's chivalrous intervention, and he's absolutely right. We cannot continue just to push this into the long grass. Action must be taken. 10 years on, Defra's position to simply encourage the regulator is clearly not happening. In fact, the lack of this data undermines Defra's review into the success of the 2010 regulations, because full data is not publicly available. In the Defra Select Committee's report in February 2016, they stated the absence of baseline data regarding issues such as injuries, euthanasia or rehoming makes it difficult to accurately assess the impact of the 2010 regulations on key welfare issues. The government acknowledged this difficulty in their response, where they said the absence of such data has made assessing the effectiveness of the regulations difficult. Another issue that goes unaddressed by Defra's review is the two-tier system of welfare standards between GBGB tracks and those licensed by local authorities. The 2010 regulations do not establish a minimum set of welfare standards for all tracks, and there are discrepancies in the way in which the Animal Welfare Act is applied and enforced at different tracks. In regard to enforcement, greyhounds racing on self-regulated GBGB tracks are not protected under the Act. On tracks licensed by local authorities, there is no mandate for the local authority to adopt and enforce the Act, and most do not, because of the financial cost of doing so and a lack of resources, which is even more of an issue in the current financial climate. To give an example of this two-tier system, in 2011, an independent trainer was banned from keeping animals for life and received an 18-week suspended sentence for giving his dog Viagra and cannabis. In comparison, in 2014, a trainer licensed through GBGB gave his greyhound amphetamine, following 2 previous incidents of administering illegal drugs. And the disciplinary committee gave him only a 6-month disqualification, suspended for 2 years, and a fine. This is a very stark example of the absence of minimum welfare standards, which the 2010 regulations have done nothing to rectify. In their submission to the 2015 inquiry into the welfare of racing greyhounds by the Defra Select Committee, the Association of Track Veterinarians who are directly employed by the GBGB stated, "We are unanimously concerned that without appropriate changes, the current regulations will not improve greyhound welfare to acceptable standards. Indeed, even current welfare standards are likely to deteriorate with time. It is clear there are significant issues with self-regulation in its current form. I am minded to support calls by various stakeholders, including the campaigning organisation Great Exploitations, who ultimately campaigned for a ban, for an independent regulator to ensure standards are adhered to and the process is publicly transparent. I would also urge the government to compel, through legislation, the collection and publication of baseline data so the industry is more transparent and welfare standards can be monitored. If the public's concern for greyhound welfare continues to be ignored, this will only exacerbate the situation and escalate calls for a ban. We cannot allow poor treatment of racing greyhounds or of animals in general to go unaddressed."
Yeah.